In this next chapter of the Furniture Workshop, what we're going to do is use the previously made couch mesh and make some changes and adjustments to it. Namely, we're going to soften the edges so that they become rounded, make some adjustments to the UV maps, and finally what we'll then add is some vertex colors. So before we begin, let's save the file so we have a restore point to go to. Save as 12_1, enter, and save the file. From this point on, because we only need the mesh, go ahead and select the layer the couch mesh is on, left click the appropriate layer button. With the object now selected, there are two ways we can edit the mesh. We can either use something called bevel, or we can change the mesh manually by adding a series of loop cuts around the mesh, which we can then manipulate. So to show both by way of comparison, what I'll do here is duplicate this mesh so we can change one mesh using one approach and the other mesh using another approach. Right mouse selecting the mesh and Shift D, which creates a duplicate. Right mouse click to deselect, and then click on the red arrow, hold Control key down and just move it to one side. This duplicates the mesh so that we can see the differences on exactly the same mesh. So again, save the file. This may seem excessive, but it's always a good idea to do version saving so that if there are any problems you can revert back to a previous restore point. By far the easiest approach to use to round off or smooth the edges of an object is to use bevel. This can only be done in edit mode, so select one of the two meshes, press tab to enter edit mode, and then we can change the viewport shading to solid so we can see what we're doing better. Switch select mode, that's Control tab, to edges and select an edge. The basic principle here is to select an edge or edges that need to be beveled and then use the bevel tool on that edge. Note the shortcut key there. Click to activate and then move the mouse. The severity of the bevel is based on the distance of the mouse from the selected edge that the bevel was assigned to. Then once you're happy with the amount of bevel, just left mouse click to confirm. Now, because this needs to be assigned to a number of edges around the mesh, let's undo that. What we need to do is go around the mesh and select all the edges to which bevel should be assigned. So we're doing this using right mouse select, holding the shift key down. And when we need to move the scene, we're releasing the shift key so that we end up with just using the navigation keys, which is the middle mouse button, shift middle mouse button, and control middle mouse button. To continue once you've moved the scene, just use the shift right mouse combination to continue selecting edges. And then once done, mesh, edges, bevel, Control B, and just move the mouse to a point at which we're happy with the amount of bevel that's assigned to the edge, and then left mouse click to confirm. And that's it. The edges of the mesh are beveled. Press tab key to exit edit mode, and what we need to do here is check the smoothing that's assigned to the mesh. So in the properties section, click modifiers and then scroll down to the edge split modifier and deactivate edge angle. Now the mesh will go super mushy, and we need to fix this using sharp marked edges. So go back into edit mode, check that we're in edge select mode, so we can either Control Tab Edges or click one of the selection mode icons down the bottom here and just Shift right mouse select a number of edges that we need to be sharp, that is hard, and you'll see the difference in a moment once we've done this. So just go around the mesh, select these edges and the inside of the seat, and then mesh, edges, mark sharp, or Control E, mark sharp. And we can see that there's a difference, a subtle difference in the way that those edges behave relative to the other edges that are quite soft. These ones are quite hard. So press the Tab key, exit edit mode, and there is a relatively quickly modified seat. That's the main advantage of using bevel. It's relatively straightforward to use. To do the same thing manually, as we'll see in a moment, we need to physically edit the mesh so that we're adding additional edges that can then be modified. So before we do that, save the file. Now, manually editing the mesh is a lot more labor intensive, but it allows more control over the shapes that result from the changes that are made. So if we select the mesh, tab into edit mode, the main tool that's used here is loop cut. With the mouse over the mesh, press Ctrl R, and this pink highlighted line will appear. That's the edge loop direction selector, or the direction in which the edge loop will be cut. So we want to place one along this front edge, so we move the mouse cursor over this leading edge here to select the loop that runs across the mesh. Left click to select, which will change to this yellow indicator, which is the actual cut line, and then left click again to confirm. Now, depending on how we want the mesh to be smoothed, we then need to determine where to place the edges on the mesh. So we want this back edge to be rounded as well, so place a loop cut there. Same again, Ctrl R, move the mouse over this leading edge here. Left click, move the mouse, and left click again. We want the edge here to be smooth, so again. Now what we can do to aid the placement of this cut is hold the Control key down, which will snap to the grid. And then again, hold Control, judge the distances, or watch the bottom left corner where it says edge slide 0.6. We want the inside of the back. Hold Control key down. We want the inside of the arms. Hold Control key down. Hold Control key down. And we can also put one underneath the seating area. Left click to confirm. Now, to create the actual bevels, all we need to do is right select the leading edges, on both sides if we want it to be even, and just left click, hold the blue arrow and move it downwards. We can hold the Control key down to snap to a grid, or to use smaller increments, keeping the Control key held, hold also the Shift key, and then let go of the left mouse button to confirm, and the keys. Now if we want to use a different value for the inside edge, select those edges, and again left click hold drag with Control Shift, release to confirm the front edge, and again confirm, and this back edge, click, hold, drag with Control and Shift held down again, release to confirm. And we can also then do it to the front of the seat. So we can either click, hold and drag that down, or we can merge the corner vertices of this leading edge to the vertices associated with the edge or loop that runs below it. But we'll get to that later, because the disadvantage of using this approach is that it creates a lot of additional edges. So if we compare that, exit, let's just turn on all the edges, with all the edges on the beveled chair. We can see a significant difference in the number of edges that are created depending on the approach used. This version, for instance, needs to be cleaned up and all the additional edges removed. So we'll do that in edit mode using a merge. So once again, before we do that, save another version of the file. So make sure the first mesh is selected again, tab into edit mode. There are two things that we can do here. This edge on the previous beveled version is beveled as a result of the tool, but on this version it's left perpendicular, because when we collapse these vertices together they create the rounded edge for us. So let's go around the mesh and do that first. So right click the vertex we need to merge to, then shift right mouse select the vertex that is being merged to the first selected vertex. Once done, Alt M and select at first, and then just repeat the process, making sure to simply right mouse select a new vertex, and then again Alt M at first. On the other side as well. And around other aspects of the mesh, along the front, along this front edge, its front inner edge, we'll get to this leading edge in a moment. Now the reason for leaving that leading edge alone was to just make sure that we collapse the correct edge on both sides before we then collapse it. So selecting that bottom vertex first, the leading edge corner and this vertex, collapse them all together, same again on the other side, and that creates a slight bevel on the front edge of the seat. So it's now a question of going around the rest of the mesh to remove the remaining vertices. So again, right mouse select individual vertices with Shift, and rather than merging, what we can do with these is remove them from the mesh. So press the X key and select Limited Dissolve. Same again. X, Limited Dissolve. What this is doing is removing these individual vertices without affecting the mesh's integrity. So again, Limited Dissolve, and continue on around the mesh, removing the remaining vertices. Once you get to a point where dissolve no longer works, it's then just a question of going around the mesh and removing each vertex or groups of vertexes individually, using the merge tool as used previously. Now it's important to note that with these corners, what we're trying to do is create a triangular surface here. That means removing this corner vertex. So select the vertex we want to collapse to first, and then the vertex we want to collapse to it second. And that creates our triangular surface. And then again, continue on around the mesh, removing vertices. And we should find that the underside of the mesh still has, yes it does, so select all of these vertices, taking care not to select the vertexes that are along the outside edge. And use X, Limited Dissolve. That will leave us with the odd stray vertex, which again needs to be removed. And then finally, because this surface was split in half accidentally through merging, we need to join these surfaces together. So Control Tab, select Face, or click the appropriate Select button. Right mouse click, Shift right mouse, and then Alt J to join them together into a single surface. Then do this again along the front of the mesh to remove any other triangular surfaces that can be joined together to form a unified or single face. Take a final look around the mesh to see if there are any other remaining problems that need to be cleared up. And as we can see in doing this, there's an odd alignment along the front which needs to be fixed. So to fix that, change select mode, right select that vertex, Make a note of its vertical position, that's the z-axis value, which is 134.999998. Then select the vertex that we want to change and replace its value with the 134.99998, matching the vertical position of the previously selected vertex. And now we have our manually beveled mesh. If we exit edit mode, we can then adjust its smoothing by clicking on the modifiers panel, deactivating edge angle again, which does the same thing as it did with the bevel version. Go back into edit mode, select edges, and again select the appropriate edges that we need to be hard. And mark those. Control E as sharp. Exit edit mode. And that's the completed modified couch using bevel and manually editing the mesh. So with that done, once again save another version of the file. Now in editing the mesh, it's likely that this has affected negatively the UV map and texture placement over the mesh. So if we switch viewport shading mode to texture, or Alt-Z, we can see that the bevel version isn't as bad as the manually edited version. We can see a lot of texture stretching and warping present on one but not on the other. Now ordinarily, as we did in the first chapter of this workshop, we selected a group of surfaces and mapped them to the texture. That's not a very efficient way to unwrap a relatively complex shape. A better approach is to use something called seams, and this involves basically just going around the mesh, selecting edges and marking them as UV seams. What this then does is that when we unwrap the mesh, the UV is split wherever one of these marked edges appears on the mesh. This allows greater control over the whole project because it means that you can make adjustments to the UV seams to fix or adjust placement without having to go back over the mesh to reselect groups of surfaces for remapping. So that's what we'll do in this next section. Now, how you choose which edges to mark will depend on how you want the UV map to be split. So if we switch the scene around a little bit, what we want to do is isolate areas of the mesh from other areas. So for instance, we have the seat and the front area of the mesh selected here. This would mean that the seams would be placed along this outside edge so that this section of the mesh is isolated from everything else. And similarly, we would do the same for either the back of the mesh, which would be this group of surfaces, and or we want the sides to be isolated from the back, which would be this group of surfaces. So either or would mean selecting and placing seams along these outer edges to delineate each area of the mesh. So let's go ahead and do that. Change to edge select. We want to isolate the back, the seat, and what we also want to do is isolate the bottom of the mesh from everything else. So go around the perimeter and select each of these edges to do that. So what we have are a series of edges selected that will split the back the seat and the two side arms into separate UV components. So once we've got our edges selected, to mark the seams, Mesh, Edges, Mark Seam, or you can use Control E, Mark Seam. The selected edges will then be highlighted orange, which you can see when you deselect. Now note the colour difference here. The blue are highlighted for edge split and the orange for seam marking. Where an edge shares either a seam or a sharp marking, it will generally highlight in the first one that's assigned to the edge. In this case that would have been edge sharp. So once we've marked the seams, make sure we've deselected everything and then reselect, so that's A, and then just press the U key to unwrap. Now to see the UV map, change the setting. Now we note there's a little bit of distortion there, so we have to place another set of seams to straighten these areas out. So select the front and make sure to replicate the selection on the opposite side. And along the back, and again replicate on the opposite side. And then mark the seams. Deselect, reselect, and unwrap. And we can then see that those UV sections straighten out. Change viewport shading so we can see the texture on the mesh. Then all we need to do is tidy up the placement of the sections. So in the UV editor, that's right middle mouse grab and drag, select islands, press R to rotate, G to grab, R to rotate, G to grab, select the island again, just move that to one side. That's the front, so we can place that there, move that side back into position, that side into position, the back into position, and the bottom we can just place anywhere because that's not going to be seen in IMVU. And that's basically the UV map tidied up after placing bevel on the mesh, fixing the problems that causes. So that's that one mesh done. Tab out. Let's do the same to the other mesh. So we want to again divide the seat from the back, which is then separated from the arms. So again, placing the edges, make sure to replicate on both sides of the mesh. And now, because we knew that this was going to cause problems, we can place the seams along the front of the arms. And then isolate the bottom. And then check the selection and place the seams. And with those done, deselect, select, and unwrap. And again, we've got a similar problem. So select the UV map, rotate to correct its orientation, select, correct its orientation. Now what we've got here is the front of the mesh and the back of the mesh as one section, so we need to double check the assignment of the seam, reselect unwrap, which results in splitting the one UV section into two separate parts. Select rotate, and continue to reorganize the sections of the UV map so they fit within the texture space that's available. Position the arms to either side of the seat area and the back just above, and the base can be placed anywhere where it will fit. Then change shading, and there we have the second chair with the UV map all cleaned and tidied up. So you can see there are advantages and disadvantages to using either or technique to round or soften the edges, and what consequences that has on the UV maps. So with that done, the next thing to do is to vertex paint. So save the file, and that's what we'll do next. Vertex painting, as the name suggests, allows us to paint or assign a colour to a specific vertex. When this is done over the entirety of a mesh, the combination of colour values that are assigned to specific vertices allows us to tint or tone the entire mesh. Now the way we do this is by switching modes from object mode to vertex paint mode. In order to see the colour, we need to make sure that the tool shelf is open, so press T. And this will give us this panel. For all intents and purposes, the main tool to use is the colour wheel, which changes the colour, and the tonal value, which changes it from full strength to no colour, which is black. And all we need to do is, with vertex paint active, simply move the mouse over individual vertices and left click to paint a colour. Now the advantage of doing this is that we can use it to either tint a mesh or shade a mesh. So if there were a texture assigned to this couch and it were already a single colour, we can use vertex colours to re-tint the colours, changing it from red to orange or green to blue, depending on the colour that we paint to the mesh. Or alternatively, what we can do, tint the mesh with black and white or grayscale shading to give the impression of shadows where areas of the mesh wouldn't otherwise be fully illuminated. Doing this eliminates the need to use complicated textures where shading or shadows are baked into them. So all we do is move around the mesh, so paint the colour or tone to the vertexes and continue tinting the mesh. And as we can see here, we've changed it from tinting the mesh blue to creating shading that gives more depth to the mesh. As we can see, the process itself of vertex painting a mesh is relatively straightforward. It's simply changing mode to vertex paint mode, selecting a colour, and then painting over vertexes to achieve the desired end result. So continue on around the mesh, painting the appropriate vertexes, and then once we're happy with the end result, that's it. The mesh is fully vertex painted. So once done, just exit and go back into object mode. And again, save the file. The next thing to do is simply re-export the mesh so that we can then replace the one that was already assigned to the product in IMVU. So to recap, what we did was take the original mesh that we made in the first chapter and beveled the edges and manually edited the edges. We then updated and amended the UV map using seams, and placing seams strategically around the mesh, and then finally painted some vertex colouring to the object. So with that done, it's just simply a question of exporting as we would normally do. So make sure the object is selected first and then the armature. File, export, and if the IMVU export script is not loaded, user preferences, add-ons, install from file, select the zip file containing the add-on, so browse the available hard drives and then folder location, highlight and click install from file. When it's installed, activate by clicking the checkbox, close user preferences. We should then have the option available to export to IMVU. So again, make sure the mesh is selected first and then the armature, and then simply export. We only need the mesh, so deselect all these other options and export. And job's done. Next, replace the mesh that we originally assigned to the product in IMVU. So once you have your project open, either edit the product from the catalog or open the local project. Simply replace the mesh, meshes, add XMF, browse to the location of your file, select, open, and apply. And there we have the new mesh replacing the old. To see the vertex colors that were assigned to the object, make sure vertex colors is activated, and then upload depending on whether this is an overwrite of a previous product or you're creating a new product. And there we have it. That concludes the second chapter of creating a simple couch chair using Blender 3D for IMVU.